Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a special edition of the Wealth Cafe. We, by popular demand, have been adding in some more of these fun interviews, especially for National Financial Planning Month. And I am so excited today to talk to Arden, and we are going to have this incredible conversation actually around IVF and fertility, which can be incredibly expensive. So we are going to unpack all of that today. So I will let the incredible Arden introduce herself and tell you everything about her. So she and I actually met a couple weeks ago, and I think she has so many gems to share. So I will let you take the stage and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. I'm so excited to be here. So yeah, like my background is in finance and writing about finance and learning about finance, much more so from kind of the personal finance, financial literacy perspective. And yeah, I am just personally really passionate about expanding people's financial knowledge and taking what can be super scary and super complicated in the world of finance and just making it a little bit simpler for folks to understand. And so I joke that by day, I run a small comms shop. Which is focused on financial inclusion. And so all of my clients, startups, nonprofits, small financial advisory firms are really focused on how do we bring in more underserved audiences into financial services. Traditional financial services was built for old white men. And there are a lot of us that can stand to benefit from financial tools and services if they are made accessible to us and actually built for us to really meet our needs. And so I work with clients to help them communicate that effectively, either to help them reach the people that their products and tools serve, or to advocate for more accessibility, for more access, whether it's with policymakers, other government institutions, to bring financial services to more folks. And then by night, and I put by night in quotes because I
Under the
love
cover of
sleep.
darkness.
But because let's be honest, I'm like sleeping at night. I love sleeping. So like also by day, I run a blog called Mother May I, which you can find at babymaking.substack.com,
Love it.
where I talk a lot about my own fertility journey and that of others. And my goal there is less to be a kind of support system and community for those going through fertility treatment, though I'm happy to do that and have a lot of conversations with folks that are going through various diagnoses, the IVF process, egg freezing, what have you. But it's really to try and bring more conversations about what it means to go through fertility treatment
Mhm.
emotionally, financially, physically, so that even folks who aren't going through this process have a better understanding of what it means for someone that's going through that in order to grow their family. So yeah, I'm so excited to be here and talk about finance and fertility and everything in between and outside.
Which is, I'm like, oh my gosh, we could be here for 6 hours going into all of this. It's so amazing. So maybe we need a part two. But I want to zoom in today and really focus on the cost around fertility.
Yeah,
And there are so many incredible communities that exist out there. So I love that you're also offering, what you're doing through your writing pairs well with the support systems and the community and everything
totally.
else, because we need both parts, right? And to
Yes.
have these conversations and these tools, and I hope this is also for, I love that your mission is behind helping to get more information and empowerment and education into the hands of people. That's the entire, mission of my channel, and what I'm doing here is let's talk about it. Like, let's give you a free resource, and if you need more, we can talk about more and see where it goes. And
Yeah, and like my a lot of my time, like a lot of my career was spent in very traditional marketing roles within sort of startups and new companies. So I always have an eye out for like where's the gap.
yeah.
And I think that there are now a lot of really great communities and support services for folks that are going through fertility, and like always happy to direct folks to those. But for me, it's like where's the gap?
Hmm.
And it is in those people that aren't quite at that stage yet and that are sort of thinking about what they might need to know at some point and how do they plan for that again, like whether it's financially or just sort of having Honestly, I think better, like more realistic expectations about what could be ahead of them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think with social media, we never have the full picture. So I'm always trying to
Yeah.
say, hey, what's the truth behind this? What's really going on? What are really the tools we need? And so I think that's something, we can unpack now is, when we started to have this conversation, it was about, okay, what is really the cost behind fertility and IVF and egg freezing? Because in my work as a financial advisor, that's something we have to plan for, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's, a same-sex couple trying to have kids, or even just your more traditional couples where it's maybe they have kids later in life, or they have any type of medical needs where they're having to go down this route. It is still a financial I don't want to say burden, but it's an on something you have to account for in your life, right? That you're now saying, okay, how are we going to pay for this, and what is the cost going to be?
Yeah, and it is a major cost. And like obviously this depends on where you go, what fertility
Mm,
coverage looks like in your state, where you live. But you're looking at an average of probably 20 to 25,000 plus for an IVF cycle. You're looking at probably a minimum of $15,000 for one round of egg freezing.
mm,
And it's a cost that a lot of us aren't planning to have,
yeah.
right? And the way that fertility treatment and testing and diagnosis works is that you don't often know that it's something that you might need to invest in until you're there. It's different than I know that I want to buy a house someday, or even I know
Mhm.
that I want to have a kid and I can look at sort of how much generally childcare might cost in my area. It is this like it is this unknown. And so even if you're someone like my partner and I that like have an emergency savings account, it's like, well, is this an emergency?
Right. Right.
Right?
It's hard because it is, because you have this kind of, in some cases, ticking time clock. I mean, we're all on a ticking time clock because we're not here forever, and you want to be a part of this child or children's lives for as much as possible. So it's like, okay, to what extent is this something that we need to reallocate funds for? And it's also
Right.
interesting. So I am currently going through, I'm a huge book nerd. So I am currently going through Keeping Finance Personal by Elise Fulmore.
I
And
love the font
so,
on
yeah.
that. Just a moment for the font.
Isn't it so? It's really aesthetically pleasing, actually,
Yeah.
too. So it was perfect timing. I was reading last night, and it's that she shared a statistic that the in 2019, the average woman was marrying at 28, which is 7 years later than the average woman in 1968. And so a lot of this is because of financial changes. They don't need to marry to have a bank account. But that also impacts, for people who are going the more traditional route of marriage, kids, and that order, you're then delaying when you're having kids, which can open up that whole,
Totally.
so I'm curious to what you've been seeing in there, because that stuck out to me, and I was like, wow, what perfect, thank you, Elise, what perfect timing to.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think my husband and I are an interesting case because we have been together since our early mid 20s. And so like I think a lot of people are there's a lot of good, necessary, also just your own personal choice reasons to wait to have kids. That for us, it was just we wanted a little bit more financial stability
Yeah.
before we started doing this. I was kind of relaunching my business in the last few
Mhm.
years, and I wanted to get that a little bit more kind of stable and off the ground before we started trying and brought a kid into the picture. We live in a really expensive place. And for other people, it is that they've met their partner kind of later in life and really wanted to do that with a partner. And so it is the delay is certainly a part, I think, of why we're seeing much more common
Mhm.
fertility treatments and fertility costs. And I think the reality is that it becomes harder to get pregnant as you get older without any other factors around infertility or anything. That the statistic that my like fertility clinic often talks about is that if you're 35 or older and you have sex with your partner at exactly the right time when you're ovulating,
Mhm.
there is a 20% max chance that you get pregnant. And that is still separate from the quality of your egg and whether or not that will become a viable pregnancy. But there is only a 20% chance if everything is working
The
as
stars
it should.
align, the wind blows the right
Everything is
way.
working perfectly, that like egg and sperm come together and start dividing. And like our reproductive system is actually not that efficient.
Yeah.
And so we're already working against that. And that number goes down. It's a little bit higher when you're younger. It's closer to 25 or 30%. And then obviously your egg quality decreases as you age, which essentially just means that you have a lower chance of carrying a pregnancy to term successfully.
Hmm.
And so we see a lot of people that are waiting. And I think as you're waiting, there's the reality is that you may need to invest money in order to grow your family. And I think for us, it's interesting because if we had my sort of official diagnosis is I have PCOS,
Hmm.
and that makes it really difficult for me to time ovulation. And there's also some correlation between egg quality. I have more follicles, I produce more eggs, but the quality actually may be lower on average.
Interesting. Okay.
And that's probably been true my whole life. It was probably true at 16
Right. You had no idea
when
though.
like they put me on birth control because my periods were miserable. But
Hmm.
no one tested for that then.
Right.
They were just like, I at that point, honestly, I'm just grateful that like my mom wasn't freaking out about putting me on birth control. The
And you had a
doctor believed
solution.
me that
Yeah.
I was in pain and like we addressed that problem. And so it is probably a diagnosis I could have had much earlier, but at this point, we didn't start trying till I was 35. So I didn't get diagnosed until I was 35.
Mm.
And so then we run into the situation of with PCOS, I probably could still get pregnant. Some people say spontaneously. I don't like the word naturally. I say farm to table.
I
I
love it.
probably still could have gotten pregnant in that 20% sort of chance, farm to table, um, with a child.
Mhm.
It would have required a lot of really sort of rigorous testing. We probably actually still would have had a little bit of help in terms of timing my cycle, but we could have not done IVF. That was an option for us given the just sort of risks and what our particular fertility diagnoses were.
Mhm.
But I have that ticking biological clock and I want to have more than one kid.
Yeah.
And so we had to decide whether we wanted to invest less initially monetarily, but more potentially with our time and continue delaying and pushing this thing out. And so for us, it was a real conversation around like risks. Honestly, in some cases, like insurance. I we could have stopped at one round of egg retrieval, which is atypical for someone at 35. I
Mhm.
would say most people, as we talked about that costs of, 15 to 25K, most people over the age of 30 that I know, this is anecdotal, need to do more than one round of egg freezing or embryo freezing to get enough eggs, especially to have more than one child.
Right.
We were sort of on the edge after one, but like maybe we had enough embryos for two kids.
You're like, fingers crossed we can do this.
But we ultimately decided it was worth the cost now
Mm.
to do another round of retrieval and have that insurance on having enough embryos for our second kid, knowing that the outcomes wouldn't be as good if we waited to do a second round of retrieval in 2 to 3 years. And honestly, factoring in the emotional costs,
Mm.
and just I'm imagining doing this round of retrieval while also caring for a toddler.
That's what I
Like
was also about to say.
it was
Timing in
hard
your life.
enough
Yeah.
already. And so it's like taking, like, there's so many different, like, it's a long answer to your question. There's like so many different factors into this, like, waiting and what we need to think about. And then even when you get to that point of being ready to like pay money for it and be like, okay, this is a thing we need to invest in, there are still more trade-offs about waiting longer and what chances do you take and how do you approach the initial treatment in order to get kind of where you think that you want to be in like 5 to 6 years from now.
Yeah, and I think you also bring up a good point of all of these different factors that are going on, right? Whether it's, okay, your home life, your job, or business, whatever it might be. How are you balancing all of those? Are you in a time where you're like, okay, I'm going to dig in and really do this? And these are not conversations that previous generations have really had to have. So it's kind of the rogue guidebook on how you do this. And I think what's also really shifted that I'd love to dive into is the different options that companies and also insurance policies are now
Yeah.
starting to cover. I know that, so I previously worked for one of the largest banks in the US, and one of the things that they were offering was actually they started to offer. I think it was up to a certain dollar amount, if I
Yeah,
remember
that's typical.
correctly. Yeah, for IVF. It was something that I like got the email for and was like, oh, that's so nice. Another day.
Yeah.
Because unless you're in that space, you don't think about it though, right? And you're not planning, oh, am I at a company or in a job? So that can also impact, especially for women, if they're on their own insurance or if they're on a spouse's or whoever's insurance they
Right.
decide to go down. Oh, are we covered for this? That's not something that people are looking at. It's, do we have HSA dollars? Can I, get
Yeah.
my eyes checked? And it's opens up a whole
Yeah.
new can of worms.
Yeah, I do think that like, over the last probably 10 years, I mean, I remember when like Facebook Meta started offering egg freezing and how our initial reactions were like, you just want to keep people at work and you just want to keep
Yeah,
these women working and like delay when they have kids. And now we're like, oh my God, this is everyone's like, this is
everyone
such a
needs to do
benefit everyone's
this.
looking
Yep.
for. But yeah, so there are a few different services now. I would say Progeny and Carrot are the ones that I see most frequently that work with companies, work with benefits providers in order to offer fertility benefit services. And you're right, like typically there's maybe a dollar amount cap. And it can be low. I mean, it can be that we're gonna help you. So we're gonna give you $10,000 for your fertility treatments.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in other cases, and I think even with my understanding is that some of this almost like works like an FSA card, like you get $10,000 sort of towards fertility treatment or more, and you just sort of use it on applicable things. You might have to go through some of their specific providers, and that's its sort of own set of restrictions.
Yep.
And then, or it works by number of treatments. And so maybe it's you get a certain number of retrievals, you get a certain number of embryo transfers, whatever else can come up. They may pay for the testing for you. It just sort of varies. So even within, like, even if a company says they offer one of these services, there are actually a lot of details underneath it about what benefits are actually provided. But it can be huge. I mean, I know a lot of people that have chosen to freeze their eggs mostly because it's offered to them and not necessarily because they definitely want kids and they definitely want to like be able to do this later, but again it's a little bit of an insurance policy.
Right.
And the thing that I think I want to emphasize too though is that I think that this is a wonderful benefit that more and more companies are starting to offer,
Mm-hmm.
but it is still specifically the big tech, big financial, big brand name companies that are offering it. And I think there's probably a broader conversation, which we don't have to get into today, about like the financial ability to have children and why people in these jobs and with these companies are more supported to do that than other folks. And then we also have insurance. And so I think I saw, because recently Gavin Newsom just signed a law in California that big insurance companies have to cover IVF and other fertility
Interesting.
coverage within California.
Okay, so it's
Um,
state by state right
it's
now.
state by
Okay,
state right
good
now.
to know.
And I don't know, like, as much as I know about personal finance, and you go into insurance land, and it
It's
is
a
just
different world.
like, it's a different world,
Yeah,
and they just make up their own rules. And
it's
so
the
I
Wild
don't sort of
West.
know all the details about it. I think something that looks interesting to me on the surface about California's law versus my understanding of New York's is that it's for you don't have to have an infertility diagnosis
Mm,
necessarily to start treatment. So basically this makes it available to same-sex couples who the issue is not sort of anatomical or biological, right? It's just that like I had a friend write a post on my blog like what do you want to do if you have a baby if you don't have sperm? Like
that's
what's the
a good
option
question.
here? Uh,
And it's also an interesting thing too. I think that back to what you said too, kind of about the whole Meta and Google and everyone else who came out as we are, people thought they were doing it to keep people at work. And it's like, well, people sometimes, I think also to what you said, want to grow their careers and be in a place where they are more financially stable before they have
Yeah,
kids. And so it's also a different dynamic of things have changed, and we can afford in a time horizon standpoint to wait later in life
right.
with these because we now have these options. And we also, I always say we live forever now. I mean, we see it's not uncommon to reach 100 anymore. And so if you have a
Yeah,
child at 40, your child is then 60 when you pass away. I mean, that's people I
yeah.
know would love to have had their parents until they were 60 years old.
Yeah, no, my grandmother is 93, turns 93 in a week or
There's,
two,
yeah,
and is like at home,
yep,
like with her, with, one of her sons upright, moving around,
yep,
brains making, cracking jokes,
yeah,
and like probably won't make it to 100. We love her to death, but being old is hard. But yeah,
happens.
it's wild. Like, and that's someone who grew up and was like even born sort of like in the shadows of the Depression.
Hmm. Yeah. And it's an entirely different dynamic. And back to what we said before, where they never have seen this in their lifetime, nor have we, where we also now have multi generations. And it's common, it's more uncommon to sit here and
Yes.
say, oh, your parents aren't still around. Or you're like, when I say to people, I have one remaining grandparent, and people are like, wow, that's incredible. I'm like, most people I meet end up having that sort of story.
Yeah. 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 And I think another reason, like, we talk about the sort of like the financial stability advantages of waiting, that kind of career development. But I also like, as you know, I'm going to therapy right after we record this. And I am I am so confident that I am going to mentally and emotionally be such a better parent now
Mm,
than I would have been a decade ago.
yeah.
I would have been 5 years ago. Like, I've done a lot of work that I think is going to make me a much better parent for my kids and also kind of for myself as I navigate parenthood and motherhood. And I'm really grateful that, like, yeah, maybe we could have started 2 or 3 years earlier if we knew it was going to take a while and basically end up at the same place anyways. But like, I don't wish that I had kids in my late 20s or early 30s, which growing up in the South is what I absolutely thought I wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's that's such a great point too, is you're also then able to, I think, fund a lot of the things. So I'm a huge traveler, right? So for me, I have been to so many different places where I can sit here, and it's not one of those things where it's like, okay, I had kids and I missed out on all these different parts of
Yeah.
seeing the world or doing this, or I have to wait until my kids are in college and I'm retired and be hobbling around the streets of Rome with a cane. It's like
Yes.
I was able to do both. And I think what, we're really trying to get at with this conversation is this has opened the door to give people more options.
Yes. Absolutely. No, it's so funny. I was talking to my mom the other day and I was joking about how my grandmother had my mom, her third child, at 28. My mom
Wow.
had me, her first child, at 28. I am currently pregnant and will have my first child at 38.
Congratulations.
And I was talking to my mom about like waiting, and she was like, you've done so much. Like, look at all that you've been able to do, before you decided to do this, right? And it's so interesting to see that reflection from other generations who didn't have this option, and to reflect on, yeah, like I mean, there's a whole conversation around retirement and how we approach that in our
Mhm.
career growth. And like, I am very much a, like, we should enjoy things now.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean I don't have a 401k and I'm not paying attention to that stuff too, but I don't want to wait until I'm 65 plus to start really enjoying and living my life. And this option to like know that we could have kids later, and there were even not understanding the costs, knowing that I needed them, knowing that IVF was an option.
Hmm.
And I think, fortunately for me, which is not true for everyone, but having a lot of people around me in my life talk about the fact that they were using IVF and other treatments to get pregnant made it less scary to wait, and made it feel like less of a risk, even though I am, paying for it, financially now.
And it's something too that if some people I know have had, fertility issues in their mid and late 20s, which is
Yes.
early
Yes.
30, like you name it, and they've had these issues. And it's
Yes.
one of those things where they're sitting there and they might be ready and at that point, but financially or career wise, they might not be in a position where they're like, great, I can afford to do this, or we can go for it. And
Right.
so it's a song and dance of kind of navigating, okay, when is the right time? When are we financially ready? And I think going back to the retirement, of 65, it's like, okay, you have the ability where you have now 10 years where where you weren't also raising a child, because let's be honest, we know that children are incredibly expensive. I'm sure if my parents listened to this, they were like, "You are, and we're the child that was expensive." Um, you started the trend, but it's one of those things where you also then had 10 extra years, and what people don't talk about is 10 extra years of being able to even add in, a small amount additionally to your 401k
Yes.
instead of spending that on childcare. You can't replace. We always talk about you can't replace time of money growth and compounding interest
Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
point. There's
Yeah.
that
And
time.
I think that connects well to sort of how we kind of approach paying for fertility treatments. And so first to like talk a little bit
Okay,
more about kind of insurance coverage. So yes, there is a law in New York that major insurance providers are required to cover fertility treatment.
Mhm.
Um, and we did have some coverage. But there's insurance companies love to make rules and
Not pay.
have a lot of fine print about what that really means.
Yep.
And so we chose to go out of network. I met with my provider and I was like, I had had enough medical experiences outside of this to know like, this is the experience that I want to have. This is the
Mm.
care that I want to receive. And it is worth us paying a little bit extra and not getting, full coverage. We can cover that cost. At the end, I think insurance maybe covered 20% of the
Better
costs
than zero.
of doing, yeah, right. And like most of our medication coverage, which can also be a really big expense.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual sort of bills to our fertility, with our fertility providers, we expected them to cover closer to 70. They covered closer to 20.
Mm.
And, that's for a lot of stuff that honestly, like I still don't fully understand. That they base what they will cover, the 70% number, on what they say is the medic, like, I don't know, let's say 200% of what Medicare would cover in that area for a treatment. I don't know a lot of people on Medicare that are going through IVF, so I don't have a great understanding of why these codes would even have a number attached to them under
Mm.
Medicare. Another thing is that they will flag portions of your treatment as experimental. And these are things that
Wow.
are very typical. I wasn't doing sort of a really unusual IVF procedure,
You're like, I wasn't
but
here as, stereo, or type A ready to be their petri dish.
right. Yeah. And that's partly related because we don't do a lot of, the FDA doesn't do a lot of research around women's health. So these are not FDA approved
Mm.
procedures, even though they've been done for decades in many cases and have plenty of journal evidence that they are effective in the way that things should be done. And so I think, I mean, a good $9,000 if each of my rounds of retrieval was labeled as experimental coverage, which means they would cover 0%. Um, and I, it's a trade-off of, again, it's like a time money trade-off, right? Like
Mhm. Yeah.
how much time, especially as someone who works for themselves, who makes money when they're
Yep.
working
Read
and
my
doesn't
mind.
when they're not, how much time am I going to spend to probably, I mean, it seems very unlikely I'm getting all of it back. Like, what's that expected value return on my time? And it doesn't seem high. Um, and so what we did kind of going in to this process, not knowing what insurance would cover, like kind of going in with open eyes, having enough medical experience or experience with the medical system to know what that looks like, we decided to put almost most of our expenses on zero APR credit cards.
Mm.
And so these have introductory periods of 0% interest. You can get them anywhere, I say from 12 to 24 months, with the hope that we would get reimbursed, because the way that the out-of-network clinic costs work is that you do pay in advance and you get reimbursed. So we paid the clinic using these credit cards. part of the reason that we chose to do that, even though we technically had that money in savings, was because we didn't want to drain our savings anymore. We wanted still to have this emergency fund.
Right.
My husband works in tech. He's an engineer. He's been laid off 3 times in the last 4 years. And so we've used up some of our savings because of that. And we also want a buffer,
Yeah, for sure. You
not
need it.
knowing what stability looks like.
Yeah.
And we're also in an environment where, even still with the recent rate cuts, high yield savings accounts, really high interest rates.
Mhm.
And so instead of going to paying off that credit card once a month with whatever we owe divided by X number of months while we have zero APR, we're just putting that money into a high yield savings account. So instead, we're earning money, we're earning interest on that money, and then just taking our free money for as long as the credit card companies want to give it to us. And so, ultimately, when we didn't get a ton of money back from our insurance companies, we have just held that debt and we're paying attention to it. We're managing it. We're continuing to put money in these high yield savings account. We're making the minimum payments every month. We have sort of a plan to pay one of those off. But honestly, if interest rates stay, sort of high on the high yield savings account side, and like these credit card companies are still sending us offers for other 0% transfer balances for
Mm.
up to 24 months, we might just move that money over. And like, I think that when I wrote about this on my blog, I was like, don't freak out. This might seem like a very bad idea to take on this credit card debt. I was like, but I work in finance. I promise I know what I'm doing.
Well, and I also want to say, like, for anybody who's watching this and is like, oh, I'm just going to go take credit cards, it's about having a plan. And that's with
Yes.
any type of investment, whether it's into IVF, into a house, into whatever it might be, it's about having the plan. And I think, and I want to point that out as people are listening to this, is you're sitting there saying, okay, we were still setting aside the money. We had the
Yes.
cash for when that time came. And this is what worked for you. And this is where in my work, I say, you can go out and you can get a robo advisor, you can do this, but finance is personal. And this is
Yeah.
the exact moment where it's like, here's what made sense for you. And somebody else watching this would be like, I'm going to go do this, but they're in a different situation. So it may not work for them.
Absolutely. And, I think the other options are, again, if you don't sort of already have the money saved up, is you can take out personal loans now that are, lower interest rates than credit cards. A lot of these clinics also have
Hmm.
decent kind of payment plans. And so Spring Fertility, who I work with, if you're doing egg freezing, they realize that egg freezing is best done when you're, in your 20s, when maybe you aren't in this financial situation to be shelling out
Afford it. Yeah.
$14,000. And so they have a really good no interest payment plan where you can, pay them, I think, $250 a month for 5 years and aren't shelling out this sort of big amount of money kind of upfront. And so those are options. There are also some grant programs to help pay for some different aspects of fertility coverage, and so it's worth looking into that. And yeah, even as someone who understands and like knows personal finance, and that like has written a lot of blog posts for clients around how I credit source calculated,
Yep.
I still talk my partner and I have a financial advisor, and we talk about these decisions with her, once a quarter. Does this still make sense? Do we want to move money around? Do we want to change anything about sort of what we're doing and where we're allocating our money, especially knowing that like we have a kid on the way and that's expensive, right? And like, how are we making those decisions? And so for right now, like we're not doing a lot of retirement investing. We've done it a lot earlier, but right now we're like, we actually need a little bit more liquidity right now. And so we're finding other ways of investing where we're not going to be penalized if we take that money out, which doesn't mean we're not going to invest in retirement again. It just means that it doesn't make sense as a priority right now. And I think, as someone who's written so much about personal finance and financial literacy, I agree that it's really important for us, especially when we're younger, to push invest in your retirement account, take that match, make sure you're getting your free money, like start there, max at your 401k. But I think we sometimes over prioritize retirement savings over some of our other maybe short-term savings
Mm,
needs. And again, this is why it's personal. There are some
right.
people that it totally makes sense for them to keep doing that, and they should. And it's like it is a good rule of thumb, but it's like, it's a rule of thumb. It's not a rule for everyone that is the perfect thing for everyone to do. And so for right now, it makes much more sense for us to be putting our sort of non-spending money, our savings, our investments in different areas for the short term. But we've already, as you said, we had this decade plus of building up something. So there's like still money there growing. It's still doing something, even if we're
You're not
not
taking
adding
it
to
out
it.
to go
Right.
and taking penalties. And it's also something that there's the ebb and flow of life, right? Like people forget that. And I had this conversation with a friend the other day, and she was like, there are seasons, right? We have seasons when it's like, hey, I'm sitting on a ton of extra cash. I'm going to go and set it aside for X, Y, and Z. I'm going to put more into retirement. I'm going to do these things. And there are other seasons, especially as we've seen high inflation, where you might be sitting here and saying, I need to focus on some different goals right now and having that cash. And it's the ebb and flow rather than we're a very all or nothing society, I find that people are like,
Oh.
I have to go all in on my retirement or I'll
Uh-huh.
never retire and vice versa. And I'm like, there's ebbs and flows, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, are you understanding where you are? And also, too, if I always show when I'm doing financial plans with clients, I'm like, okay, well, maybe if, we're reducing contributions now, what does that look like down the road? How does that change? And it's personal, right? Some clients sit there and they're like, I'm never going to retire anyway, so I need to make sure I just have enough for healthcare costs, or if I do change. And so it's the ebb and flow in the personal side of things and understanding that it's not all set in stone.
Yeah. And it's like understanding again, what those expectations, like what those impacts are over the long run, which I think is like why I am very like adamant about talking about fertility. So this is like a little bit less of a surprise, which like I'm not saying that everyone needs to save up. We probably out of pocket, we probably paid, I think between probably 40 to $45,000. Um, and I'm not saying everyone needs to save and put away 40 to $45,000 on the
No, but it
off
is good to
chance.
hear because I think transparently people don't know I'm all about cost transparency
Yeah,
and no one
same.
talks about what things really cost. So I think that's fascinating to hear what it was personally for you, and you people are going to be higher and people are going to be lower.
Yeah, yeah. But like knowing that this is possible, like this expense could happen, right? And so as you're thinking about what are the big expenses that could come up, what are you worried about? Like just knowing that this is a possibility and like, earmarking something for it, being aware of that as in your financial plan, thinking about is there any fertility testing based on symptoms you maybe had throughout your life that makes sense to get tested on
Mhm.
early? Because it's not something we talk about. We spend like, all of sex ed, all of health class in middle school and high school was, telling us it was so easy to get pregnant and we need to do everything in our power to not get pregnant. And we spend a lot of our reproductive years doing a really good job at trying to not get pregnant, putting a lot of attention into that. And then all of a sudden you want to do it and it's a lot harder,
Mhm.
even for the average person, than you may have realized. And so I think there's a lot of important kind of education on that too. So I do have an event coming up with my doctor
I
about
love it.
what they didn't teach you about fertility and sex ed
Ah,
in a couple of weeks. So I'll share the link with you so you can share that with
yeah, and I'll
folks.
put it
But
in
yeah, it's just
in the
all
comments.
about like just what are the things to consider? What do you want to know about? And I think that's true with kind of financial conversations too, and why I'm very pro, and not that you brought me here to do this, like why I'm very pro financial advisor.
I did not.
And
So
you
keep
did
going.
not, you did not. Didn't even know I was gonna say it.
No, I
Wasn't even in
didn't.
the
So
notes.
keep going. No.
Very pro financial advisor. And I think robo advising can even go into that. Like your financial advisor can take advantage of some of those tools potentially too. But I just think having someone else to help you talk through these personal decisions and sort of what those impacts are, even as someone who understands money, is something that I find really valuable and like worth paying for, even though I know that I could like spend less on these fees if I do it this way. The fact is I wasn't doing it that way.
Yeah, very few
Um,
people are. And I think it's also too having, I know for a lot of clients, whether they work with me or another advisor, it's having that sounding board too, right? And saying, hey, what does this look like? Because sometimes you need a second opinion. Even if you work, I even as a financial advisor talk to my other
yeah,
friends who are financial advisors. If I have something I'm like, I'm debating opening this versus doing that, even for my own finances, you just need to hear it. And I also want to emphasize, I love that you communicated with your advisor, like where this, what you were spending this on, because it is, right? Like that is a very nice car, what you spent. So, and those were,
yeah,
you know, we talk about buying a car when I work on a financial plan. This is another, you know, another big expense like that. So I encourage anybody who, even if it's an inkling in the back of their head, like factoring that into,
yeah,
a financial plan. And I want to wrap up with one question.
yeah.
So I ask every guest this. And so, what is something every day? So we're focused on wealth and especially women building wealth. What is one small thing that you do every day to make you feel wealthy and empowered?
Hmm. I'm gonna answer this question with a thing that I think I don't do.
Okay,
Um,
let's hear it.
so I have worked really hard to build a like stable and consistent business that allows me to not spend a lot of time stressing and worrying about where that kind of income is going to come from, and also not sort of stressing about difficult clients. I'm very picky about the clients that I work with.
As you should
And
be.
so I think very much it's the thing that I do, it's just it's even hard to articulate, but like how I approach my business, I think is more of an abundance mindset. I'm not a big mindset person. Feels a little woo-woo, but I am really
We love you.
confident that like the clients are going to come my way, the money is going to get figured out. And when I think about wealth, like I didn't grow up with a lot of money,
Mhm.
and not having money was like a source of stress and conversation and arguments. And
Yeah,
so being able to not have that anxiety, at least about this one aspect of my life and sort of how I'm bringing in money for our family, is like that's what like wealth and wellness like looks like for me, is like
I love it.
being able to bring in money and have an income without it negatively impacting my life in other ways.
I love that. And I think it's almost like a mental calm that you have around money. And I find with people that whether it's the woo-woo energetic or whatever anyone believes in, whatever it is, I
Yeah,
think it
whatever.
does change things because the way you look at it and approach it, I mean, that's putting more stress on yourself, and that cycle is never healthy, especially if you're expecting. It's not beneficial. So
Right. Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. And where can people find you? I will be including in the show notes for this the link to your event. That sounds incredible.
Yeah.
If people can attend, and where else can people connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best place is that kind of on my Substack. So that's babymaking.substack.com.
Love it.
You can also find me on Instagram at Arden Talks. I talk about, and I say, come for the inclusive finance and fertility insights, stay for the like elder millennial memes and the like reminders to stop working that much. Um,
That's
And then,
great.
yeah, definitely follow me on LinkedIn. I share a lot there too. My sort of username or whatever on that is Arden Elizabeth, like Elizabeth Arden, but backwards. That is my real name, no relation.
I didn't even realize that too.
Yeah.
That's cool. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on
Yeah.
today. I cannot wait for people to be diving into this. It will be up on YouTube as well tomorrow, and you can take a look through the entire episode and connect with Arden. She is a wealth of resources and knowledge, and I know she would love to connect with you and help in any way. So
I
thank
really
you.
would. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this week's episode of The Wealth Cafe. Looking to learn more about financial planning and wealth management? Visit tanisfingroup.com to apply for an introductory call today.